There is something you have been doing your entire life that you have never once questioned. Not because it doesn't deserve questioning, not because you haven't noticed the results, but because everyone around you is doing it too. And when everyone does the same thing, it stops looking like a choice and starts looking like gravity. It starts looking like the only way. You have been chasing. Not always loudly, not always desperately. Sometimes the chase is quiet. Sometimes it looks like discipline, like ambition, like working harder than anyone else in the room. Sometimes it looks like spiritual practice, like gratitude lists and visualization boards and morning routines designed to signal to the universe that you are ready. Sometimes the chase looks like waiting, which is just chasing with your eyes closed, still monitoring the horizon, still measuring the gap between where you are and where you believe you need to be before life can finally begin. You have been chasing abundance, and here is what no one has had the clarity to tell you directly. The chase is the problem, not a symptom of the problem, not a minor inefficiency in an otherwise sound strategy. The chase itself, the specific act of reaching toward something you have decided you do not yet have, is the mechanism that keeps collapsing every possibility before it can fully form. And I do not mean that as a metaphor. I mean it with a precision that we are going to spend the next hour unpacking until you can feel it in your body, until the specific mechanics of how this works become so clear that the old pattern simply cannot run the same way again. Because here is what is actually happening when you chase. When you reach towards something, you are simultaneously broadcasting a signal about where that thing is. You are broadcasting that it is out there, that it is not here, that there is a distance between you and it that must somehow be closed. And that signal, that specific frequency of separation, is the exact instruction your reality is receiving every single time you reach. Not the image of what you want, the feeling of the gap, the feeling of not yet, the feeling of almost but not quite. And reality, at the level where it is still fluid, at the level where quantum mechanics describes it as a field of superposed possibilities rather than a fixed structure, responds to that frequency with perfect obedience. It keeps the gap open. Not because reality is cruel, not because the universe is testing your persistence, but because the signal you are sending is a signal about distance, and reality has no choice but to mirror it back. This is where we need to go first. Before the practices, before the parable, before the deeper application to your specific situation, we need to look at what is actually happening at the level of physics when you direct your attention towards something you want. Because the moment you understand the mechanism, the moment you see it clearly and completely, you cannot unseen it. And once you cannot unseen it, the old way of reaching becomes impossible to maintain without noticing exactly what you are doing. So look closer. Quantum mechanics, and I am going to be precise here because precision is what transforms rather than just inspires. Quantum mechanics describes reality at its most fundamental level, not as a collection of fixed objects with definite properties, but as a field of probability. Before measurement, before observation, a quantum system exists in what physicists call superposition. It is not in one state or another. It is in all possible states simultaneously, each with a certain probability amplitude. The electron is not here or there. It is in a smear of possibility, a wave function that describes the likelihood of finding it in any given location if you were to look. And then you look. The moment measurement occurs, the moment an observer interacts with the system, the wave function collapses. All those superposed possibilities resolve into a single definite outcome. The electron is now here. The probability cloud is gone. What was fluid becomes fixed. This is not philosophy. This is measurable. This is the foundational experimental result that every branch of quantum physics is built on, confirmed in laboratories thousands of times in thousands of different ways. The act of observation does not simply reveal a pre-existing reality. It participates in the creation of that reality. What you observe at the quantum level, you fundamentally change. Now, here's the question that most people never ask when they encounter this principle, and it is the question that changes everything. What exactly are you observing when you reach for abundance? Because you are always observing something. Your attention is always collapsing possibility into form. The question is not whether your observation is creating your reality. It is which aspect of reality your observation is continuously selecting and solidifying. And when you reach, when you monitor the gap between where you are and where you want to be, when you check your bank account and feel the familiar tightening, when you visualize your dream life from the position of someone who does not yet have it, you are observing lack. You are collapsing the probability field around the specific frequency of not enough. You are with the most powerful instrument in the known universe, which is your focused, conscious attention, repeatedly selecting and solidifying the very condition you are trying to escape. And here's the layer underneath that. The problem is not that you want things. Wanting is not the issue. The problem is the specific quality of attention you bring to the wanting. There is a version of desire that is clean, that comes from a place of genuine creative aliveness, that reaches toward something not from a sense of deficit, but from a sense of expansion. And there is a version of wanting that is soaked in the frequency of lack, that reaches from a place of fundamental incompleteness, that carries in its very structure the assumption that you are behind, that something is missing, that the life you have is not the life you should have. Most people, when they talk about abundance, are running the second version. They have dressed it up in the language of manifestation and alignment and frequency. But underneath, the signal is the same one it has always been. I do not have enough. I am not enough. Something is wrong with where I am, and that signal, regardless of what language you wrap around it, is what your reality keeps receiving. So let's look at this even more precisely, because the observer effect in quantum mechanics has a specific mechanism that is worth understanding, not just as a metaphor, but as a literal description of how attention works. When physicists talk about the measurement problem, they are pointing at something genuinely strange. The act of measurement requires interaction. To observe an electron, you have to bounce a photon off it, and that interaction changes the electron's state. The measurement is not passive, it is participatory. The observer is not a neutral witness standing outside the system, watching it from a safe distance. The observer is entangled with what is being observed. The act of looking changes both the thing being looked at and, in a subtle but real sense, the one who is looking. Now apply this to your relationship with abundance. When you observe your financial situation, your opportunities, your sense of what is possible for your life, you are not passively reading a fixed reality. You are participating in its formation. Your attention is not neutral. It carries a charge. It carries the accumulated weight of every conclusion you have ever drawn about what you are worth, what you are capable of, what kind of life you are allowed to have. And that charged attention, when it lands on the probability field of your life, collapses it according to its own frequency. This is why two people can stand in the same set of circumstances and experience completely different realities. Not because one is luckier or more talented or more spiritually evolved, but because the quality of their observation is different. One person looks at the same situation and sees possibility. The other looks at the same situation and sees confirmation of what they already feared. And reality, being a quantum field that responds to the observer, gives each of them exactly what their observation selects. But here's where it gets even more precise, and this is the part that most conversations about manifestation and abundance completely miss. The frequency of your observation is not primarily determined by what you think. It is determined by what you feel, and more specifically, it is determined by the emotional signature that is running underneath your thoughts, the one you have been rehearsing so long it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like the truth. The quantum field does not read your affirmations. It reads your actual state. It reads the emotional frequency that is present in the moment of observation. And if that frequency is one of reaching, of monitoring, of measuring the gap, then that is the instruction the field receives. No matter how many times you say the words, no matter how carefully you visualize the outcome. The body does not lie, the field does not lie, and the results, when you look at them clearly, have never lied either. Sit with that for a moment. Don't rush past what you just saw, because what you just saw is this. The entire strategy most people are running to create abundance, the visualization, the goal setting, the affirmations, the monitoring for signs of progress, the constant measurement of the gap is built on the exact frequency that prevents abundance from forming. Not because these tools are inherently wrong, but because they are almost always deployed from within the consciousness of lack. They are techniques being run by a signal that is fundamentally broadcasting separation. And you cannot get to abundance from separation, not because the universe is withholding it, but because separation is the observation that keeps collapsing the field into the form of separation. This is what I mean when I say your entire relationship with abundance is backwards. You have been trying to change the outcome while leaving the observer unchanged. You have been trying to rearrange the results while the instrument that is creating those results, your quality of attention, your emotional frequency, the specific thing you are actually observing when you look at your life, remains exactly as it was. If this is landing for you, take a second to like this video and subscribe so we can keep going deeper together. Now back to the work. Let me show you something. There was a man named Elias who spent 12 years building what he called his practice. Not a spiritual practice, a practice of acquisition. He had lists, he had vision boards, he had journals filled with the specific details of the life he was working toward, the income, the house, the sense of freedom, the feeling of finally having arrived. He meditated on these things every morning. He visualized them with precision. He read every book about wealth and consciousness and frequency that he could find. And every year, he was slightly more frustrated than the year before. Not because nothing was happening. Things were happening. Opportunities arrived. Money moved. His life was not static. But there was a quality to his experience that he could not name, a persistent sense that whatever he achieved was never quite the thing, that the moment something arrived, it immediately became the new baseline and the gap opened up again ahead of him, slightly farther away than before. He would reach a financial milestone and feel for perhaps 2 days, the relief of arrival. And then the monitoring would resume, the measuring, the awareness of the next gap. He thought the problem was his strategy. He kept refining his techniques. He tried new visualization methods. He experimented with different affirmations. He worked with different coaches who each gave him a slightly different version of the same instruction. Feel it as if it's already real. Align your energy, raise your vibration. He tried, he genuinely tried, but there was something he was not willing to look at. Something he had been carefully not looking at for 12 years. And it was not the thing he thought it was. One morning, Elias was sitting in his usual visualization practice, eyes closed, running through the images of the life he wanted. And something unusual happened. Instead of moving through the images as he usually did, he stopped. He stopped and he looked not at the images, but at himself looking at the images. He turned his attention around. And what he saw stopped him completely. He saw that every single visualization he had ever done was being conducted from the perspective of someone who did not have the thing. The images were always out there, always ahead, always in the future. And the one doing the visualizing was always here, always in the present, always in the position of the one who was reaching. He had never once visualized from inside the life. He had always visualized it from outside, like a person with their face pressed against a window, looking into a room they were not in. And in that moment, he understood something that no book had ever made clear. The visualization was not creating the frequency of abundance. It was creating, over and over, with exquisite precision, the frequency of wanting abundance, the frequency of not yet, the frequency of separation. He had been, for 12 years, training himself to feel the gap. And reality had been, for 12 years, with perfect faithfulness, keeping the gap open. The shift that happened next was not dramatic. It was not a breakthrough in the cinematic sense. It was quieter than that, more like a correction of something that had always been slightly off. He did not change what he was visualizing. He changed where he was standing when he visualized it. He moved from outside the window to inside the room. He stopped looking at the life and started looking from within it. And the feeling was entirely different. Not the feeling of having finally arrived. The feeling of already being here, of already being the kind of person for whom this is simply what life is, not a destination, a residence. And the quality of his attention changed. Not because he had manifested the outer circumstances. The outer circumstances were the same. But the observer had changed. And when the observer changes, the field that the observer is collapsing changes with it. This is the bridge between the parable and your life. And I want you to look at it directly. You have been standing outside the window. You have been doing your practices, your visualizations, your affirmations, your gratitude lists, all from the position of someone who is reaching towards something that is not yet here. And that position, that specific stance of the observer, is what has been shaping the field. Not the content of your thoughts, the position from which you are thinking them. The question is not what you are trying to create. The question is where you are standing when you try to create it. What was the moment for you when you first noticed you were standing outside the window? The specific instant when you caught yourself looking at your life rather than living from inside it. Drop it in the comments. These precise observations matter more than you know. Now let's go deeper into what you are actually seeing when you look at your relationship with abundance. Because there is a layer underneath the reaching that most people never examine. And it is the layer that is actually running the show. When you feel the pull toward abundance, when you feel the desire for more money, more freedom, more security, more aliveness, there is a story underneath that pull, a story about what the arrival of abundance would mean, about what it would prove, about what it would finally allow you to feel. And that story, not the desire itself, but the meaning structure underneath the desire, is the real signal you are broadcasting. For most people, the story goes something like this. When I have enough, I will be safe. When I have enough, I will be worthy. When I have enough, I will be able to stop proving myself and simply be. When I have enough, the anxiety that runs underneath everything will finally have permission to quiet down. Look at that story. Look at it directly without flinching. Because what that story is actually saying is this: right now, I am not safe. Right now, I am not worthy. Right now, I am not enough. And abundance is the thing that will fix that. And here is the quantum mechanics of that story. When you are observing your life from within that story, every piece of evidence gets filtered through it. Every opportunity gets evaluated through the lens of whether it will finally be enough. Every achievement gets measured against the standard of the story and found inevitably slightly short. Because the story is not looking for evidence of abundance. The story is looking for confirmation of itself, and it will find it every time. Because that is what observation does. It selects, it collapses, it creates. The story of not enough is the most powerful manifesting force in most people's lives, not because they believe it consciously. Most people would deny it immediately if you named it directly, but it is running underneath everything, shaping the quality of every observation, determining what the probability field collapses into every single time. And here is what makes this so precise, so worth looking at without blinking. The story of not enough is not a thought you can simply replace with a better thought. It is not a belief you can update by reading the right book or repeating the right affirmation. It is an emotional frequency that is embedded in the body. It is a pattern of nervous system activation that has been rehearsed so many times it has become the baseline, the default, the thing that feels like reality rather than a choice. Your nervous system has learned to associate abundance with threat. I want to say that again because it is the thing that most conversations about wealth and consciousness dance around without ever landing on directly. Your nervous system has learned to associate abundance with threat, not consciously, not deliberately, but through years of accumulated experience, through the specific ways abundance was modeled or not modeled in your early environment, through the messages you received about money and worth and what kind of people have things and what happens to people who want too much. Your body has built a very specific physiological response to the idea of expansion. And that response is not excitement. It is not readiness. It is a subtle but persistent contraction. A bracing, a waiting for the other shoe to drop. And that contraction is the signal. That is what the field is receiving. Not your vision board, your body's learned response to the possibility of having what you say you want. This is why self-sabotage is not a character flaw. It is not weakness or laziness or a lack of commitment. It is the body doing exactly what it was trained to do. When abundance gets close, when an opportunity arrives that could genuinely change things, the nervous system recognizes the pattern and activates the familiar contraction. And from within that contraction, you hesitate. You second guess. You find the reason it won't work. You unconsciously create the conditions that confirm what the body already expected, and then you call it bad luck. But look closer, it was not luck. It was the observer doing precisely what observers do, collapsing possibility according to the frequency of the observation. And the frequency of the observation was fear wearing the costume of caution. So now we have arrived at the real question. Not how do you manifest abundance, not how do you raise your vibration or align your energy or become magnetic. The real question is this: how do you change the observer? Not the thoughts, not the techniques, not the strategy. The observer itself. The one who is doing the looking, the one whose quality of attention is continuously shaping the field. And the answer is not what you expect. You do not change the observer by fixing the observer. You do not change the observer by becoming more spiritual, more disciplined, more positive, more aligned. You change the observer by watching the observer, by turning attention around on itself, by looking at the one who has been looking with the same clear, unflinching quality of attention that you would bring to anything else you truly wanted to understand. This is the practice, not a metaphor for a practice, the actual practice, and we are going to do it right now. Pause here. This is not a thought exercise. This is an observation. I want you to bring to mind the specific feeling you have when you think about your financial situation. Not the thoughts about it, not the analysis or the plans or the strategies. The feeling, the raw, immediate, pre-verbal feeling that arises in your body when your attention lands on the state of your abundance right now. Find it. It is probably in your chest or your stomach or your throat. It has a texture. It has a quality. It might be tight or heavy or slightly hollow or buzzing with a low-grade anxiety that you have learned to ignore. Find it and look at it, not at the thoughts about it, not at the story around it, at the feeling itself as a pure sensation in your body. Now do not try to change it. Do not try to replace it with a better feeling. Do not analyze it or explain it or trace it back to its origins. Simply watch it, with the same quality of attention you would bring to watching clouds move across a sky. Notice what happens when you watch it without trying to change it. Most people discover in this moment something surprising. The feeling, when watched without resistance, when met with clear, neutral attention, rather than the usual flinching away or the effortful pushing towards something better, the feeling begins to shift on its own. Not because you made it shift, because observation itself, when it is truly clean, when it is genuinely without agenda, has a transformative quality. Not because you are doing something to the feeling, but because the feeling, like every quantum system, responds to the quality of the observation it receives. What you resist persists. What you truly see transforms. This is not poetry. This is the mechanism. And when you feel it operating in your own body in real time, you understand something that no amount of reading about it could give you. Now go one layer deeper. While you are watching the feeling, I want you to notice who is watching, not as a philosophical question, as a direct observation. There is a feeling in your body. There is an awareness that is watching the feeling. Those are two different things. The feeling is the content. The awareness is the context. And the awareness, the one who is watching, is not the feeling. It is not the story about the feeling. It is not the history that produced the feeling. It is prior to all of that. Watch from that place, from the awareness that is watching the feeling rather than from within the feeling itself. Notice the difference in quality between those two positions. From within the feeling, everything is urgent, everything is evidence, everything confirms the story. From the awareness that is watching the feeling, there is a spaciousness, a steadiness, a quality that is not indifferent, but is also not swept away. That is the observer state. That is the position from which reality can actually be changed. Not through force, not through effortful manifestation, but through the quality of clear, steady, non-reactive seeing. Because from that position, you are no longer inside the frequency of lack. You are watching the frequency of lack. And what you watch, you are no longer identical with. And what you are no longer identical with, you can change. This is where the entire conversation about abundance needs to begin. Not with strategy, not with technique, not with a better visualization practice, with the cultivation of this quality of attention. With learning to be the one who watches rather than the one who is always, automatically, immediately swept into the content of what is being watched. Let me take this further, because there is a specific thing that happens when you inhabit the observer state in relation to abundance, and it is the thing that makes everything else possible. When you are the observer, when you are genuinely watching your relationship with abundance rather than being inside it, you begin to see something that was invisible from inside the pattern. You begin to see the specific places where you are choosing contraction, not unconsciously, not automatically, but in real time, in the moment of the choice. You see the moment when an opportunity arrives and something in you immediately begins to calculate the ways it might not work. You see the moment when someone offers you something and you feel the impulse to minimize it, to deflect the compliment, to shrink back from the visibility. You see the moment when your income increases and your spending immediately rises to meet it, not from genuine desire, but from the body's learned need to return to a familiar level. You see the moment when you are about to charge what your work is actually worth. And the story begins, the one about being too much, asking for too much, wanting too much. From inside the pattern, these moments are invisible. They happen too fast. They are too automatic. They are too thoroughly woven into the texture of how you move through the world to be noticed as choices. They feel like reality. They feel like just the way things are. From the observer position, you can see them happening in slow motion with perfect clarity. And here's what that clarity does. It does not give you the ability to force yourself to make different choices. Forcing is still the old pattern, still the reaching, still the effortful pushing against what is. What clarity does is something more elegant and more permanent. It makes the unconscious pattern visible. And once a pattern is visible, once you can watch yourself doing it in real time, it begins to lose its automatic quality. It can no longer run on autopilot, because autopilot requires invisibility. It requires that you not be watching. The moment you truly see what has been running your reality, it loses its power over you, not because you fought it, not because you replaced it with something better, because you looked at it directly. And in the light of that direct, clear, unflinching seeing, the pattern had to become conscious, had to become a choice rather than a reflex. And once it is a choice, you can make a different one. This is the actual mechanics of transformation, not the version that gets sold in most conversations about abundance, which is essentially the same old effortful striving dressed in spiritual language. The actual mechanics, the one that operates through clarity rather than force. Now let's look at the specific quality of attention that creates the frequency of abundance. because this is where the conversation needs to get very precise. Because most descriptions of what abundance consciousness feels like are so vague as to be useless. Feel good, be grateful, raise your vibration. These are directions without a map. What does the frequency of abundance actually feel like at the level of direct experience, in the body, in the quality of attention? It feels like sufficiency, not the dramatic arrival of everything you have ever wanted, not the overwhelming relief of finally having enough. Something quieter and more fundamental than that. It feels like the absence of the reaching, like the specific sensation of not monitoring the gap, like what is present when the constant background checking, the measuring, the evaluating of where you are against where you think you should be simply stops. Most people have never felt this, or if they have felt it only in brief flashes, moments when they were so absorbed in something they loved that the monitoring machinery temporarily went quiet. A moment of genuine creative flow, a moment of deep connection with another person, a moment in nature when the mind stopped its calculations and simply received what was there. In those moments, the quality of your observation changed completely. You were not reaching, you were not measuring, you were simply present, simply watching, simply here. And in those moments, if you look back at them carefully, you will notice that they had a quality of abundance to them that had nothing to do with your financial situation. A quality of fullness, of enough, of something that did not need to be more than it was. That quality, that specific frequency of present moment sufficiency is the observer state in relation to abundance. And it is available not just in moments of creative flow or natural beauty, but as a cultivated quality of attention that you can learn to inhabit deliberately, consistently, as the baseline from which you move through your life. Let me show you exactly how this works in practice. Not as an abstract principle, but as a specific embodied shift that you can make right now, and that you can return to every time the reaching begins. Here's the second practice, and this one is different from the first. The first practice was about watching the feeling of lack without trying to change it. This one is about something more specific. It is about observing what is already here, not as a technique for gratitude performance, but as a genuine act of quantum observation. As a deliberate choice to collapse the probability field around sufficiency rather than around lack. Right now, in this moment, before anything changes in your outer circumstances, there are things present in your life that are not nothing. There is the fact that you are here, that you are listening, that something in you had enough curiosity and enough courage to keep looking. There is the specific texture of whatever space you are in right now, the air, the light, the physical reality of your body. There is the fact that you have access to information, to perspective, to the possibility of seeing things differently than you have seen them before. These are not consolation prizes. They are not the poor substitute for the real abundance you are waiting for. They are actual present moment reality, and the quality of attention you bring to them right now in this moment is determining the frequency that the probability field is collapsing around. So observe them, not as a performance of gratitude, not as an affirmation of abundance that you are trying to convince yourself of, as a genuine act of observation, as a real, present, clear-eyed seeing of what is actually here. Notice what happens to the reaching when you do this. Notice whether the gap, the one between where you are and where you think you need to be, is quite as solid as it felt a moment ago. Notice whether the quality of this moment, attended to directly, has a different texture than the quality of the future moment you have been reaching toward. The observer who is genuinely present does not feel lack, not because they are pretending the outer circumstances are different, but because lack is not a feature of the present moment. Lack is a feature of the story about the present moment, and the story requires the mind to be somewhere else, measuring the present against a future that is not here. When you are here, actually here, observing what is actually present rather than measuring the distance to what is not yet present, the frequency of the observation shifts, and the field shifts with it. Now let me take this to a layer that most conversations about abundance never reach. Because we have been talking about the frequency of your observation and how it shapes the probability field. But there is something even more fundamental underneath that. Something that, when you see it clearly, changes the entire relationship with the question of abundance. Here it is. You are not lacking abundance. You are lacking the capacity to perceive it. These are not the same thing, and the difference between them is everything. When you believe you are lacking abundance, the solution is acquisition. Get more, attract more, manifest more. The problem is out there in the external world, and the solution is to bring more of the external world toward you. When you understand that what you are lacking is the capacity to perceive abundance, the solution is entirely different. The solution is not acquisition. The solution is observation. The solution is learning to see what is already present. Not because what is already present is all you will ever have. Not because there is no room for growth and expansion and genuine material change, but because the capacity to perceive abundance in the present is the exact capacity that allows abundance to form in the future. They are the same capacity, the same quality of observation. A person who cannot perceive the abundance that is already present in their life will not be able to perceive the abundance that arrives in the future. They will achieve the milestone and immediately measure the new gap. They will receive the money and immediately calculate what is still missing. They will arrive at the destination and discover that the destination is now the new baseline and the horizon has moved again. This is not a character flaw. It is the natural result of an untrained observer. An observer who has been conditioned to see gaps, to measure distances, to evaluate the present against a future standard. That observer will find gaps everywhere at every level of material reality because finding gaps is what it has been trained to do. The training of the observer, the cultivation of the capacity to genuinely perceive what is already present is not a consolation prize for people who cannot have more. It is the prerequisite for being able to hold more, for being able to receive more without immediately collapsing it back into the familiar frequency of not enough. This is why you see people who have achieved significant material success and are still somehow running the same anxiety they had before the success arrived. The outer circumstances changed. The observer did not. And so the observer continued doing what it had always done, finding the gap, measuring the distance, broadcasting the frequency of not yet. And this is why you see people with relatively modest material circumstances who carry a quality of genuine sufficiency, a quality of ease and groundedness, and what can only be described as a kind of inner wealth that has nothing to do with their bank balance. The outer circumstances are modest, but the observer is trained. The observer has learned to collapse the field around presence rather than around lack. And that quality radiates. It creates a different experience of the same circumstances, and over time it creates different circumstances. Because here is the thing about the observer that the quantum mechanics is pointing at. The observer is not passive. The observer is not simply reading a reality that exists independently of the observation. The observer is participatory. The observer is entangled with what it observes. And an observer who has cultivated the capacity to genuinely see abundance, to collapse the probability field around sufficiency and presence rather than around lack and distance, is an observer who is continuously, moment by moment, participating in the creation of a different reality, not through force, not through effortful manifestation, through the simple, profound, extraordinarily powerful act of seeing clearly. What you watch, you change, and when you change what you watch, you change the one who is watching. And when you change the one who is watching, you change what is possible to see. Let me show you the third layer of this, because we have been building towards something and this is where it lands. There is a woman named Mira who had spent years studying everything she could find about consciousness and abundance and the relationship between inner state and outer reality. She was genuinely intelligent, genuinely committed, and genuinely frustrated. Because despite understanding all of it intellectually, despite being able to explain the principles clearly and even teach them to others, her own life kept circling the same patterns. She would make progress and then lose ground. She would feel aligned and then find herself back in the familiar anxiety. She would do the practices and feel the shift and then watch the shift evaporate within days, sometimes within hours, and she could not understand why, until the day she stopped trying to understand it and simply watched it. She was sitting in her usual morning practice, going through the steps she had refined over years, when she caught herself doing something she had never consciously noticed before. She was evaluating the practice. In real time, while she was doing it, she was monitoring it for results. She was checking whether it was working, whether she felt different, whether the frequency was shifting, whether this would be the session that finally produced the breakthrough she was waiting for. She was observing her observation, and her observation of her observation was soaked in the same frequency of not yet that she was trying to transcend. She was doing the practice from within the story, and the story was, I am not yet where I need to be, and this practice might be the thing that finally gets me there. And that story, running underneath every practice, every visualization, every moment of genuine spiritual effort, was continuously broadcasting the same signal. Distance, gap, not yet. The practices were not working because the practices were being run by the pattern they were supposed to dissolve. And when she saw this, when she actually watched it happening in real time rather than understanding it as an intellectual concept, something shifted that had never shifted before. She stopped doing the practice, not permanently, but in that moment she stopped. She put down the effort. She put down the monitoring. She put down the evaluation, and she simply sat. Not meditating, not visualizing, not aligning or calibrating or raising her frequency, simply sitting, simply being the awareness that was present in that moment. Not trying to change anything, not trying to create anything, not trying to get anywhere. And in that stopping, in that genuine, complete, non-effortful stopping, she felt something she had been reaching toward for years. Not abundance as an arrival, not abundance as a destination finally reached, but abundance as the natural quality of awareness that is not reaching, the fullness that is present when the grasping stops. The sufficiency that has been here all along, underneath the story of not enough, waiting to be perceived by an observer who was finally still enough to see it. It did not change her bank account that morning, it changed the observer. And the observer began to move through the world differently. not with a performance of abundance, with the genuine, grounded, unforced quality of someone who no longer needs to reach because they have discovered that what they were reaching for has been here the whole time. The bridge between that story and your life is this: the reaching has been the obstacle, not a minor inefficiency, the actual obstacle. The specific thing that has been keeping the field collapsed around lack. And the solution is not a better reaching technique, it is the discovery of what is present when the reaching stops. Now, let's look at the specific thing you have been avoiding observing, because this is where the transmission gets personal. And I want to be very direct here, because the directness is the point. There is a specific story you tell about yourself in relation to abundance, not the general story about wanting more or working toward your goals. A specific personal story, a story about what kind of person you are in relation to money and success and the possibility of having what you want. And that story has a specific quality to it that you have probably never examined directly. Maybe the story is that you are someone who always almost makes it, who gets close but something always intervenes, who can see the life they want clearly but cannot quite seem to close the distance. Maybe the story is that you are someone who is good at many things, but not at the specific things that create financial abundance, that you are somehow constitutionally unsuited to the kind of success you see other people having. Maybe the story is that wanting too much is dangerous, that people who have a lot lose something important, that abundance comes with a cost you are not sure you want to pay. Maybe the story is quieter than any of these. Maybe it is simply the background assumption so deeply embedded you have never had to articulate it, that this is just how things are for you, that the gap is real and permanent and the evidence of your life confirms it. Whatever the specific story is, I want you to do something that most people never do. I want you to watch it, not think about it, not analyze it, not try to figure out where it came from or whether it is true or how to replace it with a better story. Watch it, the way you would watch a cloud, the way you would watch a wave, as something that is arising in your awareness, moving through it, and that has no more permanent claim on the truth of what you are than a cloud has a permanent claim on the sky. Because here is what observation reveals about any story, including this one. A story is not a fact, it is a pattern of attention. It is a habitual way of organizing experience. It is a lens that has been ground over years of repetition into a particular shape. And when you look through it, everything appears to confirm the shape of the lens, not because reality is confirming the story, because the lens is selecting the evidence that matches its shape and filtering out the evidence that does not. When you watch the story instead of looking through it, you discover this. You discover that the story is not what you are. It is what you have been observing yourself through, and the moment you see the lens, the moment you observe the story as a story rather than experiencing it as reality, the lens begins to lose its transparency. It becomes visible, and visible lenses can be put down. Not through force, not through replacing one story with a better story, which is just a different lens, through the simple, radical act of watching the story so clearly that you can see it is a story. And then, from the observer position that is prior to all stories, choosing what to observe. This is the third practice, and it is the most powerful one. Find the specific story, the one about you and abundance, the one that has been running so long it feels like a description of reality rather than a choice. Find it and watch it. not as something to be fixed or replaced or healed, as something to be seen clearly, completely, without flinching. Watch the specific words of the story. Watch the emotional quality it carries. Watch the way it organizes your perception of your circumstances, selecting certain evidence and ignoring other evidence. Watch the way it creates the reaching, the monitoring, the gap measuring. Watch the way it makes certain possibilities invisible and certain outcomes feel inevitable. Watch all of this without trying to change any of it. And then watch what happens to the story when it is truly seen. When it is genuinely, completely, unflinchingly observed. What you will find is this. The story, like every quantum system, responds to the quality of the observation it receives. When it is observed from within, when you are inside it and looking through it, it is invisible and therefore absolute. When it is observed from the outside, when you are the awareness watching the story rather than the character inside the story, it begins to lose its solidity, its edges become visible, its constructed quality becomes apparent. And from that position, from the awareness that can watch the story without being the story, the field is genuinely open. The probability space has not been collapsed by the story's frequency. The observer is not broadcasting lack. The observer is simply present, watching, clear, and from that position, something becomes possible that was not possible before. Not because you have attracted abundance from somewhere else, but because you have stopped continuously collapsing the field around its absence. This is what the thumbnail is pointing at when it says you are not lacking. Not as a positive affirmation, not as a feel-good reassurance, as a precise description of what the observer discovers when it finally looks clearly at what is actually present, rather than at the story about what is missing. You are not lacking, you have been observing lack. And the observer who has been observing lack is not the truth of what you are. It is a pattern of attention that has been running so long it has come to feel like identity. But identity, when watched closely enough, when observed with enough steadiness and clarity, reveals itself as a construction. And a construction, seen clearly, can be put down. Has there been a specific illusion about yourself or your circumstances that dissolved the moment you looked at it directly rather than through the story? The moment the lens became visible and something you thought was fixed turned out to be a choice. Tell us in the comments what you saw when you finally stopped looking away. Let's look at one more layer, because everything we have covered so far has been building toward this. And I want to make sure we land it completely. There is a question that arises naturally from everything we have been exploring. If the observer state, the quality of clear, present, non-reaching attention, is what allows the field to collapse around abundance rather than around lack, then what is the relationship between that state and genuine practical action in the world? Is this simply a sophisticated form of passivity? Is the invitation to stop reaching an invitation to stop doing? No. And the distinction here is one of the most important ones in this entire transmission. There is a quality of action that comes from the observer state, and it is entirely different from the quality of action that comes from the reaching state. Not in its outer form necessarily. Both might involve the same behaviors, making calls, building things, putting work into the world. But in its inner quality, in the frequency from which it is being done, they are completely different. And that difference is what the field responds to. Action from the reaching state is driven by the gap. It is fueled by anxiety, by the monitoring, by the sense that something is wrong with where you are. and that this action might be the thing that fixes it. It carries in its very structure the frequency of not enough, and that frequency is present in everything the action touches, in how you present yourself, in how you communicate, in the quality of what you create, in the way you relate to the people you are trying to serve or collaborate with. Action from the observer state is driven by genuine creative aliveness. It comes from a place that is not trying to fix a gap, but is expressing something that is already present. It carries the frequency of sufficiency, of someone who is not desperate, who is not performing, who is not trying to prove something, but is simply doing what they are here to do with the full quality of their attention and their skill. And the difference between these two qualities of action is immediately perceptible to everyone in the field, not as a conscious evaluation, but as a felt sense. People can feel the desperation in a pitch even when the words are polished. They can feel the neediness in a negotiation even when the terms are reasonable. They can feel the anxiety in a creative work even when the execution is technically accomplished, and they can feel the opposite. They can feel the groundedness of someone who is genuinely present, who is not trying to close a gap, who is offering something real from a place of genuine sufficiency. And that quality draws, not because it is performing confidence or manufacturing charisma, but because it is the natural frequency of an observer who has stopped collapsing the field around lack. This is what changes when you change the observer, not just the inner experience, though that changes profoundly. The quality of every action you take changes. The quality of every relationship you are in changes. The quality of what you create changes, because the frequency of the one doing it has changed. And the frequency of the one doing it is what everything in the field responds to. Let me be specific about what this looks like in practice, because I want to give you something you can actually use, not just a beautiful description of a state you are supposed to somehow inhabit. The practical shift is this. Before any significant action, any conversation that matters, any creative work you are putting into the world, any decision that carries weight, pause. Not for a long time, for 30 seconds. For the time it takes to actually ask yourself a single honest question. What is the frequency I am bringing to this? Not what is my strategy, not what is my goal, not what do I want the outcome to be. What is the frequency I am bringing to this? Am I doing this from the reaching state? From the gap, from the anxiety about what will happen if it does not go well? Or am I doing this from the observer state, from genuine presence, from the quality of attention that is not monitoring for results, but is simply here fully with what is? And if the honest answer is the reaching state, do not force yourself to fake the observer state. Do not perform groundedness while feeling anxious. That is just a more sophisticated version of the same inauthenticity. Instead, watch it. Watch the reaching. Watch the anxiety. Watch the gap monitoring. With the same clear, non-judgmental attention that we have been practicing throughout this transmission. Watch it until you can feel the difference between being inside it and watching it. And from the watching position, from the genuine observer position, make your choice about the action. Because from the observer position, the action will carry a different quality. Not because you have manufactured a better feeling, but because the observer is genuinely not inside the reaching. And the field responds to that difference. This is the practice that changes everything. Not the visualization, not the affirmation, not the gratitude list. the cultivation of the observer state as the baseline from which you act. The deliberate, consistent, practiced return to the awareness that is watching rather than the story that is reaching. And I want to be honest about something. This is not easy. Not because it is complicated, it is actually the simplest thing there is. But it requires something that most people are not used to giving. It requires the willingness to stop, to actually stop reaching, stop monitoring, stop measuring the gap, even for a moment. And for a nervous system that has been trained for years to associate that stopping with danger, to associate the absence of striving with falling behind, that stopping feels genuinely threatening. The body will resist it. The mind will generate reasons why now is not the right time to stop reaching, why the circumstances are too urgent, why this particular situation requires the anxiety and the monitoring and the effortful pushing. The story will make a very compelling case for its own necessity. Watch that too. Watch the story about why you cannot stop reaching. Watch it with the same clear, unflinching attention. Because that story, the one that says the reaching is necessary, that says the gap is real and the monitoring is responsible and the anxiety is just being realistic, that story is the deepest layer of the pattern. It is the story that protects all the other stories. It is the guardian of the whole construction. And when you watch it clearly, when you see it as a story rather than as reality, when you observe its constructed quality with genuine, complete attention, you discover something that changes the entire landscape. The reaching was never necessary. The monitoring was never protecting you. The anxiety was never wisdom. They were all the natural expressions of an observer who had been trained to see lack. And an observer who has been trained to see lack can be retrained. Not through force, through the simple, repeated, consistent practice of seeing clearly. This is what Quantum Watcher is pointing at. Not a technique for getting more, a fundamental reorientation of the observer. A return to the natural state of awareness that is not inside the story of not enough, but is watching it clearly from the position that has always been prior to it. The observer is the most powerful position in the universe, not because it controls, not because it forces, but because it sees clearly. And clarity, genuine clarity, the kind that comes from looking directly at what had been running your reality without flinching, is the only force that transforms without resistance. You do not need to chase abundance. You need to stop collapsing the field around its absence. You need to train the observer. You need to cultivate the quality of attention that can genuinely perceive what is already present, that can act from sufficiency rather than from lack, that can move through the world as someone who is not monitoring the gap but is simply here, fully, with what is. And from that position, from the genuine, grounded, clear-eyed observer position, abundance is not something you attract. It is something you stop preventing. Now I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. Not answer it quickly, actually sit with it. What would you do differently tomorrow if you genuinely believed, not as an affirmation, but as a lived reality, that you are not lacking, not that abundance is coming, not that you are on your way? That right now, in this moment, the fundamental premise of lack that has been organizing your perception of your life is not a description of reality. It is a choice of observation. What would you do differently? How would you show up in the conversations you have been dreading? How would you present your work? How would you receive what comes toward you? How would you move through the specific circumstances of your actual life if the story of not enough was no longer the lens you were looking through. I am not asking you to pretend the outer circumstances are different. I am asking you to notice what changes when the observer changes. What becomes possible? What becomes visible? What actions become natural that currently feel forced or desperate or somehow out of reach? Because that noticing, that specific act of observation, is itself a shift in frequency. The probability field responds to it, not in some mystical, unverifiable way, in the measurable, reproducible, physically grounded way that quantum mechanics describes. The observer participates in the formation of reality. Change the observer, change the reality that forms. You've been watching your life through the lens of lack for so long that the lens has become invisible. This transmission is an invitation to see the lens, to watch it clearly, to discover that you are not the lens. You are the awareness that can watch the lens, and the awareness that can watch the lens is not inside the story of not enough. It is prior to it. It is free of it. It is the one position from which genuine change is possible. Not change as arrival. Not change as finally getting to where you have been trying to get. Change as a shift in the quality of the observation itself. A shift in what is being continuously selected and solidified from the quantum field of possibility. A shift from the frequency of lack to the frequency of presence. From the reaching to the seeing. From the gap to the ground. This is not a philosophy. This is the mechanics of how reality forms. And once you see it clearly, once you genuinely watch it operating in your own experience, in your own body, in the specific patterns of your own life, it cannot unsee itself. The observer who has seen clearly cannot go back to pretending they have not seen. The lens that has been made visible cannot become invisible again. The story that has been watched as a story cannot fully reclaim the authority of reality. This is what changes, not the outer circumstances, at least not immediately. The observer. And the observer changed, moves differently through the world, acts from a different frequency, collapses the probability field around a different reality. And the outer circumstances, being the faithful mirror of the observer's frequency, begin to reflect something different back. Not because you manifested it, not because you attracted it, because you stopped continuously creating its absence. Here's what I want to leave you with, and it is not a summary, it is a final observation. You came here looking for a better strategy, a better technique, a better way to get what you have been reaching toward. And what you found instead is something more valuable and more disorienting than that. You found that the reaching itself was the strategy that was not working, and that the alternative is not a different strategy but a different position. The observer position, the one that has been available to you this entire time underneath the reaching, prior to the story, present in every moment as the awareness that can watch all of it without being any of it. That position is not something you have to build or achieve or manifest. It is what you already are when you stop being the story, when you stop being the gap, when you stop being the monitoring and the measuring and the anxious calculation of the distance between where you are and where you think you need to be. It is what is left when all of that stops, and it is not empty, it is not passive. It is not the absence of aliveness or ambition or the genuine desire for more. It is the fullness that has been here all along, the sufficiency that does not need to be created because it has never actually been absent, the abundance that is not a destination to be reached, but a quality of attention to be inhabited. You are not lacking. You have been observing lack, and the observer is not the observation. The one who watches is not what is watched. See that clearly. Watch it until you feel it in your body. Return to it every time the reaching begins, not as a discipline, as a recognition, a remembering of what you already are when you stop looking away from it. The moment you truly see what has been running your reality, it loses its power over you. And what has been seen cannot be unseen. If something in this transmission landed in a way that shifted something, I want to hear about it. Not the general response, the specific thing. The specific moment when something you had been looking through became visible as a lens. Drop it in the comments. Because this channel exists as a field of observers, and what one person sees clearly makes it easier for everyone else to see. Your specific observation matters. Share it. If someone in your life is running the reaching pattern, someone you can see is collapsing the field around lack without knowing, that is what they are doing. Share this with them. Not as a prescription, as an invitation to look. And if this is the kind of transmission that lands differently in stillness, come back to it when the noise of the day has settled or when you find yourself reaching instead of watching. What you notice the second time through will not be what you noticed the first time. The observer who returns is already different from the one who arrived. And stay. Because what we are doing here is not a series of videos about the same idea. It is a progressive training of the observer. Each transmission goes somewhere the previous one did not. Each one reveals a layer that the one before it was pointing toward but could not fully show. The observer who stays becomes, over time, a fundamentally different quality of awareness. And that quality of awareness is the only thing that actually changes anything. You were never meant to look away. Now you see. And what has been seen cannot be unseen.